The key ingredients to a biblical sermon would be looking at exposition, illustration, and application. In other words, explaining the meaning of the text and then illustrating that meaning and then applying that meaning. You've got to do that if it's going to be a biblical sermon, because the text itself is what we're preaching. We're not just preaching sermons, but we are preaching text. And that's why I like to call the kind of preaching that we're teaching at Southwestern Seminary, for example, text-driven preaching. It's a term that I've been using for over 20 years in teaching preaching. And basically, we're attempting to stay true to the substance of the text, the structure of the text, and the spirit of the text. So biblical preaching involves a text of Scripture within its context, so that we are taking account of the important contextual factors and the meaning that is revealed in that Scripture that's encoded by the author, and then we are teasing out that meaning and doing so in a way that is contextually related to an audience, so that they can clearly understand what that text means, what it says to them. And that's vital to good preaching. We've got to be biblically based. We've got to preach texts of Scripture. And we need to be text-driven in that process, letting the actual structure of that text that encodes that meaning, bringing that out in a clear way that people can understand. And then we need to illustrate it. Illustration is a vital part of good biblical preaching. Even the Bible preachers make use of illustration. The Old Testament prophets, New Testament apostles, and writers of the New Testament all make use of illustration in the communication of biblical truth. And so good preaching today that is biblical preaching ought to follow that example. And so illustration is also important. But the text of Scripture, the writers of the New Testament, for example, are big on application. They're not just communicating truth, which they are, doctrinal truth, but they are applying it. They're saying, look, here's how you live. Here's how to put it into practice. And good biblical preaching should also involve application. That's a vital part of what good preaching should do. We should also be motivating people to obey the Scripture, persuading them, attempting to encourage them to do what the Scripture says. That's what the biblical authors did, looking at the preaching of Jesus all the way through the apostles in the New Testament. We are attempting to persuade people to do that which Scripture teaches. And so I think all of these, there are many other things that are vital and important in terms of delivery and clarity and all of that, but biblical preaching involves taking a text of Scripture and unfolding the meaning of that text in a Bible kind of a way, in a contextual relationship with an audience that they can understand, using terminology, using illustrations, and communicating in a way that the message impacts their lives. There's much more that could be said about it, but certainly that much can be said about what are the key ingredients of biblical preaching.